You ever notice how the quietest exit leaves the loudest echo? Standing here today, I'm reminded of a young man I met in South Central back in '92. His name was Marcus, and he had this fire in his eyes. Not the kind that burns everything down, but the kind that lights the way forward. He told me something that stuck with me all these years. He said, when my father walked out on us, my mama didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even say his name again. She just worked harder, smiled brighter, and lived better. And you know what? That silence spoke volumes. That's what we're talking about today. Not the kind of revenge that comes from throwing stones or spreading poison. We're talking about the kind of revenge that comes from your absence becoming your power. The kind that doesn't need thunderclaps and lightning. Just the steady rise of your sun while others wonder where your storm went. Let me tell you something, and this might hurt a little bit, but sometimes the people who do you wrong are waiting for your reaction. They're sitting there expecting you to explode, to fall apart, to show them just how much power they have over your peace. And that's exactly why your absence becomes your strength. In 1995, I visited a prison in New York, met an inmate who'd spent 15 years behind those walls. He told me his story of redemption, but what struck me most was what he said about his former gang. They kept waiting for me to send word out to try and get even, but my silence, that drove them crazy. They couldn't understand why I wasn't playing their game anymore. See, when you remove yourself from the equation, when you step away from the drama and the chaos, something magical happens. The people who tried to break you suddenly realize they've lost their power. But here's the thing. This isn't about being passive. This isn't about running away. This is about running towards something better. Think about water for a moment. When you try to grab it, it slips through your fingers. But that same water over time can carve through solid rock. Not by force, but by consistency, by simply being what it is and continuing to flow forward. That's what your absence should be. Not empty space, but a flowing river cutting its own path. I remember meeting a woman in Chicago, must have been around 2000. She was a teacher, been at it for 30 years. She told me about a time when politics and personal vendettas threatened to push her out of her school. Instead of fighting back, instead of getting down in the mud, she poured all her energy into her students. She created after-school programs, mentored young teachers, built something so beautiful that those who tried to harm her became irrelevant. Her success became a revenge, but it was revenge that lifted others up instead of tearing anyone down. You see, when you focus on revenge in its traditional sense, you're still giving power to those who hurt you. You're still playing their game, just on a different field. But when you act as if your absence is your revenge, you're playing your own game entirely. You're writing your own story, and they become nothing more than a footnote in your journey. Let me break it down for you in a way that might hit home. Have you ever had someone you trusted betray you? Someone who took your kindness for weakness? Someone who thought they could define your worth? We all have. And in those moments, our first instinct is to prove them wrong, to show them exactly what they lost, to make them regret their choices. But what if I told you that the most powerful response isn't a response at all? What if your greatest weapon isn't what you do, but what you don't do? What if your strength lies not in your presence in their life, but in your absence? I met a businessman in Atlanta back in '89. He'd built his company from nothing, and his partner tried to force him out, tried to steal everything he'd worked for. Instead of engaging in a public fight, instead of letting bitterness consume him, he quietly started a new venture. No announcements, no threats, no drama. 2 years later, his new company had revolutionized the industry while his old partner was still stuck fighting yesterday's battles. That's the power of absence, is revenge. It's not about what you take away from others. It's about what you build for yourself. It's about understanding that your energy is your most precious resource. And every moment you spend plotting revenge is a moment you could have spent plotting your success. You know what's interesting about success? It has this way of making your absence felt even more deeply. When you're winning, when you're growing, when you're becoming the best version of yourself, that's when those who doubted you, who hurt you, who tried to hold you back, that's when they really feel your absence. Not because you're trying to make them feel it, but because your life has become too full, too rich, too meaningful to include space for their negativity. Think about a garden for a moment. When you pull out a weed, what's the best way to make sure it doesn't grow back? You don't salt the earth? That hurts everything around it. No, you plant something beautiful in its place. Something that grows so strong, so vital, that there's simply no room for weeds to take root again. That's what your life should become. Not a battlefield where you fight old hurts, but a garden where you grow new possibilities. I'm going to tell you something that might be hard to hear at first. Your absence isn't just about physically removing yourself from toxic situations. It's about mentally and emotionally graduating from spaces that no longer serve your growth. It's about understanding that sometimes the best way to show someone they can't have power over you is to show them they can't have any of you at all. Back in '87, I met a young athlete. His coach had benched him unfairly, tried to break his spirit. Instead of complaining, instead of fighting back, he spent every extra moment training at a different gym, working with different mentors. When he finally left that team, he didn't just succeed, he soared. His absence became a testimony not just to what his old team had lost, but to what he had found within himself. You see, true power doesn't come from making others feel small. It comes from growing so big that their attempts to contain you become almost comical. It comes from reaching such heights that their low blows can't even reach you anymore. Not because you're trying to prove anything to them, but because you're too busy proving things to yourself. There's something powerful about understanding the difference between leaving and letting go. When I visited a small town in Mississippi in '91, I met a woman who taught me this lesson in a way I'll never forget. She'd been the backbone of her family business for 20 years. Her brothers had taken advantage of her loyalty, used her skills while denying her any real ownership. Everyone expected her to fight when she discovered their betrayal. Said she opened a small cafe 3 towns over. Never said a word about what happened, never tried to compete, never even mentioned their name. 2 years later, her cafe became the heart of her new community. Not because she was trying to show up her brothers, but because she poured all the energy she used to waste on resentment into creating something authentic, something true. Her whole family business. It started falling apart the moment she left. Not because she sabotaged it, but because they never realized that her quiet strength was what held everything together. That's what I want you to understand about using your absence as revenge. It's not about destruction. It's not about causing pain. It's about understanding that sometimes the greatest power comes from removing your energy from situations that don't deserve it. It's about recognizing that your presence is a gift, and not everyone has earned the right to receive it. I remember walking through the streets of the Bronx in '85, met a young artist who'd been rejected from every major gallery in the city. They told him his work wasn't commercial enough, wasn't what people wanted to see. Instead of changing his style, instead of trying to prove them wrong, he started creating his art in abandoned buildings. He disappeared from the gallery scene entirely. 10 years later, those same galleries were begging to represent him, not because he'd changed, but because his absence had created a void that no one else could fill. You see, when you truly understand your worth, you don't need to announce it, you don't need to prove it. You just need to invest it where it will grow. Think about the strongest people you know. Are they the ones constantly fighting battles, constantly trying to, or are they the ones who know when to walk away, who understand that their energy is too valuable to waste on wars that don't lead to growth? Back in '78, I knew a man who worked at a steel mill in Pittsburgh. His supervisor took credit for all his innovations, pushed him down at every opportunity. Everyone expected him to file complaints to fight back. Instead, he started teaching night classes at the local community college, sharing his knowledge with young people who dreamed of better futures. 5 years later, dozens of his students were revolutionizing industries across the country. His supervisor, still stuck in the same position, taking credit for other people's work, never understanding that true power isn't about controlling others. It's about creating value that speaks for itself. Let me tell you something about value. Real value, the kind that changes lives, doesn't diminish when it's ignored. It doesn't decrease when it's underappreciated. If anything, its absence makes it more apparent. Like oxygen. You don't think about it until it's gone, but when it's gone, nothing else matters. I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about all the energy you've spent trying to prove people wrong. All the nights you've laid awake planning how to show them what they lost. All the times you've dimmed your own light trying to cast shadows on those who hurt you. Now imagine taking all that energy and investing it in yourself. Not in spite, not in anger, but in 2002, I visited a community center in Detroit. Met a group of teenagers who taught me something profound about the power of absence. Their neighborhood had been written off by politicians, abandoned by businesses. Instead of protesting, instead of begging for attention, they started cleaning up their own streets, started teaching each other, started building their own opportunities. Their absence from the cycle of complaint and dependence spoke louder than any protest ever could. You see, when you act as if your absence is your revenge, you're not just removing yourself from a negative situation, you're creating space for something positive to grow. You're not just walking away from what hurts you, you're walking toward what heals you, what strengthens you, what makes you more than you were before. Think about the ocean for a moment. When it recedes, it doesn't do so to punish the shore. It recedes because that's part of its nature, part of its power. And in that recession, it reveals treasures that were hidden beneath the surface. That's what your absence should be. Not a punishment for others, but a revelation of your own depths. I met a writer in New Orleans, must have been around 82. His publishing house had rejected his novel, told him to write something more commercial. Instead of compromising his vision, he started self-publishing local stories, building a community of readers one person at a time. When his old publishing house came calling years later, he didn't even take the meeting. Not out of spite, but because he'd built something more meaningful than they could ever offer him. That's the kind of revenge we're talking about. The kind that doesn't leave scars on others, but builds monuments to your own growth. The kind that doesn't require you to become what you hate, but allows you to become more of what you love. The kind that doesn't drain your energy, but multiplies it. You know what's beautiful about this kind of revenge? It's that it transforms you while you're not even thinking about revenge anymore. Because at some point along the way, while you're building and growing and creating, you realize that success isn't about getting even. It's about moving forward with such purpose that looking back becomes a waste of time. There's a symphony in silence, a power in absence that no amount of noise can match. When you understand this, when you truly embrace it, you become unstoppable. Not because you're trying to prove anything to anyone, but because you're finally free to prove everything to yourself. Your absence becomes not just your revenge, but your renaissance. You know what fascinates me about shadows? They only exist where light can't reach. I learned this lesson in a profound way back in '76, visiting a small boxing gym in Philadelphia. There was this trainer, everyone called him Old Joe. He'd been pushed out of the biggest gym in the city where he'd trained champions. They thought they'd broken him. But Old Joe, he opened a tiny gym in the basement of a church, never advertised, never competed with his old place, just focused on training kids from the neighborhood. Kids nobody else believed in. 10 years later, while that big gym was struggling to stay open, Old Joe's kids were winning national championships. Not because he set out to destroy his old gym, but because he understood that true light doesn't fight shadows. It simply shines elsewhere, creating new possibilities, new horizons. That's the depth of what we're talking about when we say your absence is your best revenge. It's about understanding that your energy, your light, is too precious to waste trying to illuminate spaces that are determined to remain dark. It's about finding the places, the people, the purposes that amplify your light instead of trying to dim it. I remember visiting a small farm in Georgia in '88. Met a woman who'd lost everything in a divorce. Her home, her savings, her social standing. Her ex-husband had turned their whole community against her with lies. She told me something I'll never forget. She said, "I could have stayed and fought each lie with truth. Instead, I decided to plant new seeds in new soil." She moved just one county over and started growing organic herbs, built relationships with local restaurants. 5 years later, she created the largest organic herb supplier in the state. Her success wasn't built on bitterness. It was built on basil, on thyme, on letting go and letting grow. See, there's a difference between moving on and moving up. Moving on is horizontal. You're still on the same level as your pain, just in a different location, moving up. That's vertical growth. That's transcendence. That's understanding that the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting elevated. Back in '93, I met a teacher in Boston. The school system had passed him over for promotion 5 times, despite his incredible track record. Now, it was instead of filing complaints or becoming bitter, he started an after-school program in his garage. Began teaching kids how to code, how to think critically, how to believe in themselves. Today, some of the biggest tech companies in the world were founded by kids who learned in that garage. The school system that passed him over, they now send their teachers to learn his methods. That's what power looks like. Not the power of position or title, but the power of purpose. The power of knowing that your absence from one space can create presence in another that changes lives. When you understand this, really understand it, you stop seeing closed doors as rejections and start seeing them as redirections. I want to tell you about a musician I met in Nashville. Must have been 80 or 81. His band had kicked him out right before they got their big break. He was devastated. But instead of trying to compete with them, instead of trying to prove they'd made a mistake, he started teaching music to kids with disabilities, created a whole new method of music therapy. Today, his impact on lives through music goes deeper than any hit record could have. His old band? They had their moment of fame, but he created a legacy. You see, when you act as if your absence is your best revenge, you're not just removing yourself from a toxic situation, you're transplanting yourself into fertile soil. You're not just closing a door, you're opening a window to possibilities you couldn't even see before. Because sometimes the universe's biggest gifts come disguised as its harshest rejections. Let me share something with you that might change how you see everything we've been talking about. In '95, I visited a nature reserve in California. The ranger told me about how forest fires, as devastating as they seem, actually create space for new growth. Some seeds won't even open without the heat of the fire. Your absence from painful situations, it's like that fire. It might feel like destruction at first, but it's actually creating space for something new to grow. Think about the people who've hurt you, who've underestimated you, who've tried to dim your light. Now think about what would happen if you took all the energy you spend thinking about them, dealing with them, trying to prove them wrong, and invested it in something entirely new, something they can't touch, can't influence, can't even understand. I met a chef in Miami back in '84. His business partner had stolen his recipes, his restaurant concept, everything. Instead of taking legal action, instead of trying to compete, he started cooking free meals for the homeless. Used his skills to train people who needed second chances. Today, his food truck empire employs hundreds of people who've turned their lives around. His old partner's restaurant closed after 2 years. Not because he wished it would fail, but because purpose always outlasts pretense. There's a power in choosing where you shine, in understanding that your light isn't meant for every space, and that's okay. Some people will never value what you bring to the table, not because it isn't valuable, but because they're not ready for that kind of feast. And that's when your absence becomes your statement. Your silence becomes your speech. Remember that young man I met in Philly back in '90? His story teaches us something crucial about this kind of revenge. He'd been passed over for jobs because of how he looked, where he came from. Instead of letting bitterness take root, he started his own business from his mom's kitchen. Didn't advertise, didn't promote, just focused on making the best product he could. Today, some of those same companies that rejected him are his biggest clients. Not because he set out to prove them wrong, but because excellence has a way of proving itself. The most powerful moves in chess aren't always the ones you make. Sometimes they're the spaces you leave empty. I learned this lesson in a profound way from a street chess master in Washington Square Park, New York, back in '87. He'd been banned from professional chess for refusing to play by someone else's rules. Instead of fighting the system, he created his own legacy, teaching thousands of kids how to think strategically, how to see the whole board, how to understand that sometimes the best move is no move at all. You see, when we talk about absence as revenge, and we're really talking about the art of strategic emptiness, it's about understanding that your vacancy creates a vacuum that nothing else can fill. I remember visiting a community in New Orleans in '79, right after a major corporation had abandoned their neighborhood. Instead of begging the company to return, instead of protesting their departure, the community turned the empty warehouse into a cultural center. Today, that space generates more life, more opportunity, more real value than that corporation ever did. That's the thing about true power. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to fight for recognition. It simply needs to be exercised with purpose. When you remove yourself from situations that diminish you, you're not just creating an absence. You're creating an opportunity for your real presence to be felt somewhere else. Let me tell you about a woman I met in Seattle back in '83. She'd been the heart of her church choir for 20 years. When a new minister came in and pushed her out, everyone expected drama, expected fights, expected tears. Instead, she started singing at the local homeless shelter. Never said a word about what happened. Today, that shelter has one of the most successful rehabilitation programs in the country, all built around the power of music. The church choir, they're still trying to find their voice. You see, revenge isn't about what you do to others. It's about what you do with the energy you save by not engaging in their drama. It's about understanding that your power isn't in your ability to destroy, but in your capacity to create. When you really understand this, you stop seeing yourself as a victim and start seeing yourself as a vector, a force moving in a new direction. I met a basketball coach in Chicago, must have been around '91. His school had hired someone else as head coach despite his years of dedication. Instead of fighting the decision, he started coaching at the local youth center, focused on kids everyone else had given up on. 5 years later, while his old school's program was struggling, his kids were getting college scholarships, not because he set out to prove anyone wrong, but because he set out to prove something right. That's what we're really talking about here, the difference between revenge and redemption. Revenge keeps you tied to the past, keeps you dancing to someone else's rhythm. Redemption, that's your own song, your own beat, your own story. And sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones where the main character simply exits stage left and builds a whole new stage. Back in '77, I visited a small town in Texas, met a man who'd lost his family business to a larger corporation. Instead of becoming bitter, instead of trying to compete, he started teaching business skills to ex-convicts, created opportunities for people society had written off. Today, the businesses his students have started generate more revenue than the corporation that took over his family store. That's not revenge. That's revolution. You know what's interesting about revolutions? The real ones don't usually start with a bang. They start with a quiet decision, a subtle shift, a strategic absence that creates space for something new to emerge. When you understand this, you start to see that your absence isn't just about leaving. It's about leading yourself to better opportunities, leading others by example, leading change by creating space for it to grow. I remember a conversation I had with a dancer in '86. She'd been cut from a prestigious company, told she didn't have the right look. Instead of trying to change herself to fit their mold, she started teaching dance to children with SPEC, created a whole new form of movement therapy. Today, her methods are used in rehabilitation centers worldwide. The company that rejected her, they're still stuck in their old patterns, still trying to force everyone into the same mold. That's the power of authentic absence. It's not about conforming to someone else's expectations or fighting against them. It's about conforming to your own truth, fighting for your own growth, creating your own standards. When you do this, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. Your life becomes the proof. Think about water again for a moment. When it encounters an obstacle, it doesn't try to break through. It finds another path. And in finding that path, it creates new channels, new possibilities, new ways forward. That's what your absence should be like. Not a retreat, but a rerouting. Not an end, but a beginning. In '92, I met an architect in San Francisco. His firm had taken credit for his designs, pushed him to the margins. Instead of filing lawsuits, instead of fighting back, he started working with communities to design affordable housing, creative spaces that change lives. Today, his community-based projects have revolutionized how we think about social housing. His old firm, they're still building the same old boxes, still taking credit for other people's creativity. You see, when you act as if your absence is your revenge, you're not just removing yourself from a negative situation, you're removing the situation's power over your future. You're not just creating space between you and what hurts you. You're creating space for what can heal you, grow you, transform you. Let me tell you something about transformation. Real transformation doesn't happen in the spotlight. It happens in the quiet moments, in the empty spaces, in the gaps between where you were and where you're going. It happens when you stop trying to prove your worth to those who couldn't see it and start proving it to yourself by creating something worthy of who you're becoming. I want to tell you about the most powerful lesson I ever learned about absence. It was in a prison yard in '82. An inmate showed me his garden, this beautiful, thriving thing in the harshest environment imaginable. He told me something I'll never forget. He said, when I was on the outside, I was always trying to be somebody by taking from others. In here, I learned to be somebody by giving something beautiful to the empty spaces. That's what we've been talking about all along. Not just absence as a form of revenge, but absence as a form of rebirth. When you remove yourself from toxic situations, from people who can't see your worth, from places that dim your light, you're not just creating an empty space where you used to be. You're creating a canvas where something new can grow. Let me share with you what a wise woman in Memphis told me back in '74. She'd been the first black teacher in her school, faced discrimination daily. When they tried to force her out, she didn't fight. Instead, she opened a literacy center in her basement, started teaching adults who'd never had the chance to learn to read. Today, that center has helped thousands of people transform their lives. The school that tried to push her out, they named their library after her, not because she demanded it, but because excellence demands recognition. You see, there's a difference between leaving and being liberated. Leaving is physical. You just move your body from one space to another. But liberation, that's spiritual, that's emotional. That's understanding that your absence from spaces that don't value you is actually your presence in your own destiny. I met a factory worker in Detroit, must have been around '88. His supervisors had stolen his innovative ideas for 30 years. Instead of becoming bitter, instead of fighting back, he started teaching innovation workshops in his garage. Today, some of the most successful inventors in the country started in that garage. His old factory, still running the same old machines, still stealing the same old ideas, never understanding that true innovation comes from liberation, not limitation. That's what happens. When you understand the power of strategic absence, you stop trying to prove your worth to people who've already decided not to see it. You stop trying to fit into spaces that were never built to hold your greatness. You start creating your own spaces, building your own tables, writing your own stories. Back in '80, I visited a small restaurant in Harlem. The owner told me how she'd been pushed out of her family's restaurant business. Her brothers thought they could run it better without her. Instead of fighting for her place, she opened a tiny soul food place 3 blocks away. Never advertised, never competed. Just cooked with love, treated every customer like family. Today, her restaurant is a landmark, a place where people line up around the block. Her brother's place closed years ago, not because she wished them ill, but because purpose outlasts pettiness every single time. You know what's beautiful about this kind of revenge? It doesn't leave scars. It leaves legacies. It doesn't create victims. It creates victories. When you understand this, really understand it, you stop seeing your absence as a loss and start seeing it as a launch pad. I remember talking to a young man in Oakland back in '72. His crew had kicked him out, thought he was too soft because he wanted to go to college. Instead of trying to prove his toughness, he poured all his energy into his education, started a tutoring program for kids from his neighborhood. Today, he sent more kids to college than anyone else in his community, his old crew. Most of them are either locked up or lost. Not because he wanted them to fail, but because success is the best direction away from negativity. That's what we're really talking about. When we say your absence is your best revenge, we're talking about the courage to walk away from what hurts you toward what heals you. The wisdom to understand that every space that rejects you is directing you toward a space that needs you. The strength to know that your worth isn't determined by where you're not wanted, but by where you're truly valued. In a 90, I met an artist in Baltimore. His gallery had dropped him because his work was too controversial. Instead of changing his style, instead of fighting for recognition, he started teaching art in juvenile detention centers. Used his controversial style to help young people express their truth. Today, his students' artwork hangs in museums around the world. The gallery that dropped him. They're still showing the same safe, marketable pieces. Never understanding that true art isn't about fitting in, it's about standing out. See, when you act as if your absence is your best revenge, you're not just making a statement about where you won't be. You're making a declaration about who you are. You're saying that your energy is too valuable to waste on warfare, too precious to spend on proving points, too powerful to be diluted by drama. Let me leave you with this final thought. In 75, I visited a lighthouse keeper in Maine. He told me something profound about absence. He said, the light doesn't shine to show you what's wrong with the darkness. It shines to show you the way forward. That's what your absence should be. Not a shadow cast on those who hurt you, but a light showing others the way towards something better. Because in the end, the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about getting ahead. It's not about showing others what they lost. It's about showing yourself what you can be. It's not about the space you leave behind. It's about the spaces you create, the lives you touch, the legacy you build. Remember, your absence isn't just your revenge. It's your renaissance. It's not just your exit. It's your entrance into something greater. And when you understand this, truly understand this, you'll realize that the greatest revenge isn't in making others feel your absence. It's in becoming so present in your own purpose that their presence or absence no longer matters at all. You are not defined by the spaces that rejected you, but by the spaces you create. You are not measured by who didn't want you, but by what you build when you walk away. Your revenge isn't in their regret. It's in your revival, your renewal, your relentless journey forward. Because the truth is, when you truly understand your worth, absence isn't just revenge. It's redemption. And redemption, my friends, is the sweetest revenge of all.